Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the channel. It is, as you can maybe see behind me, about 4:30 in the morning. I couldn't sleep for anything last night. Well, I also went to bed at like 7 p.m., 7:30 maybe. So anyway, we are here bright and early. And I was going to work out. I was like, I don't know if I want to. I have a meet in a couple weeks. And I didn't know if it was worth, sort of put myself out there this morning. Early morning workouts either go really well or go very terribly. And I'm just not willing to run the risk of it going terribly. So here we are. So in lieu of that, what I thought I would do is take a little bit of time to discuss using percentages versus using RPE with my tactical population. Or really with any population. Well, I mean specifically with tactical, but I guess the principles that I may or may not talk about, depending on how much I ramble, can really be applied to any situation. It's just that I work with tactical, so we're just gonna talk about that. So let's talk about percentages first, right? So percentages are very straightforward, right? You take a 1 rep max or an estimated or an established 1 rep max, and then you take a certain percentage of that, and that yields a training number, right? A training load, which is very useful for certain situations. Now, what are those situations? Well, situations in which you can very closely monitor, control, and account for external factors that contribute to fatigue and stress accumulation across a training cycle. So what does that mean? So let's look at like Olympic lifters. Okay, so Olympic lifters are a really good example, I think, of using percentages as compared to using an RPE. Now, I'm not saying that every Olympic lifter uses strictly percentages or doesn't use RPE. There's probably a blend, right? It just comes down to the coaching style, the athlete style, all that kind of stuff, right? But typically, in more of a semi-linear, pseudo-linear approach to training, percentages are very valuable because they're very controllable, right? You can very precisely prescribe how much load you want an athlete or a lifter, or in this case, an operator, to use. So if you're looking to, again, precisely control or acutely control load and fatigue management or load or fatigue accumulation, percentages are very useful because, again, they're very precise. If I have a working max of 100 pounds, 75% of that is 75 pounds, right? So it's a very precise, very specific load under which you'd be operating, which is great if you exist in a world in which you can account for or can control, again, those external factors that contribute to fatigue and load and stress accumulation. So like in an Olympic quadrennial cycle, perhaps, like especially, again, we're talking about Olympic lifters here, right? Like weightlifters, like clean and jerk and snatch, right? Very different for like sprinters and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, if we're looking at an Olympic level quadrennial cycle or an Olympic level quadrennial athlete, so to speak, the likelihood of that athlete's life revolving very much around training is probably very high. Meaning that as the coach, you can say, okay, I know that athlete X is going to be training on these certain days. We're going to be doing these certain things over, X amount of weeks, whatever, right? Whatever your micro, meso, or macro cycle looks like. But you know what's happening in that athlete's life, right? Especially, I would say, more in like the European or like the sort of Eastern Bloc countries. Like let's look at like I think Bulgaria, right? Very like historically, right? The Bulgarian method was very aggressive, but we won't go into that so much. That's what we're talking about today. But like let's say like Russian or like again a Bulgarian, probably very highly accounted for. And okay, let's talk about Lasha. Okay, Lasha Talakadze, right? The Georgian lifter, the Georgian super heavyweight who just destroys everybody. I can guarantee that while he has freedom to live his life as he chooses, especially as we approach like a world's championship or an Olympic championship, an Olympic level event, his life revolves around training. That's a state-sponsored event, right? So he's probably paid by the state. He's probably fed and homed by the state, all that kind of stuff, right? So they basically pay for him to train. So his coach can then account for all these things that he's doing outside because he knows what's happening outside of the weight room or outside of the training hall, which is great because then you can say, okay, I know that he's doing X, Y, and Z things, and that's going to have A, B, and C sort of effect on his training, so I can then adjust my percentages based on that. Okay. However, so again, while percentages may yield this very precise and controllable and measurable load, which can be great for peaking for an individual event, right? If I'm running like a basic block periodization or sort of a traditional linear or Western periodization model where I'm just increasing the percentage over time, that what that's going to yield is peaking for a specific singular event. So again, if we're looking at a quadrennial cycle, there may be like worlds in there, right? So you know as a coach or as the programmer or the handler or whatever it is, even if you're doing your own training as an athlete, you know when these events are, so you can peak yourself, so you can be in optimal condition, or your strength is at its highest, or whatever sort of metrics, technical metrics. Like what I mean by technical is like skill based, so like your ability to execute the clean and jerk and the snatch, right? Your technical proficiency is high, your strength is high, and your conditioning is high all at the same time, right? Now one of those things is probably going to suffer at a certain point, right? Because it's hard to raise all those metrics at the same time, in unison, right? It may kind of go like this, where like one rises up, maybe falls a little bit, right? So like, just comes down to how you want to program that. But the percentage-based overload system, or the percentage-based progression system, or method, model, whatever, allows you to, again, precisely control the load that you are being exposed to so that you can peak for a singular event and be in the best condition, the best shape, and the best sort of preparation that you can be for that particular event. Again, fantastic for something like a quadrennial Olympic cycle, right? Not so great, in my opinion, for this population, operators, who theoretically can be out the door at any time. Now, for the most part, training schedules, battle rhythms, excuse me, whatever you want to call it, are relatively predictable, right? It's not just this chaotic, haphazard, like, oh, let's go do this today, let's go do this tomorrow type thing. Like, things are planned out, ranges are planned out, events are planned out, deployments are planned out. Now, again, though, it could happen at any time, right? You could get called up, you could say, hey, we have a mission, we have an objective we have to go do, right? And that's going to throw a wrench in any sort of training cycle, whether it's strength and conditioning or whether it's, job-specific, tactical, or technical, right? So the percentage-based system in the tactical environment is less than ideal because it is so precise. And you may have an individual who so background a little bit, right? So typically an ODA exists within a 12-man roster, right? Now, most of the teams with which we work are not at that full strength. So I think a couple of the teams I have right now are about like 6 to 8 guys. And of those 6 to 8 guys, there's usually 1 to 2 that are gone, or who are gone, like doing a school or doing a course or doing, some sort of mission, whatever that mission might be, right? So they never operate at full strength. But the point I'm trying to make is that you may have a cohort of guys who are around, and then you have an individual who is absent, right? Who may not be able to execute your programming based on where he's located or what he's doing, right? A lot of the places these guys go are very austere. They don't necessarily have access to great equipment, or they don't have the time, or it's just not a priority to train, right? So I have an individual who's currently TDY, so temporary deployment. Basically, he's gone. He's gone right now, and he's just not around, right? So what's going to happen is when he comes back after this month-long TDY, after this month-long tour, he's going to be a month behind. So if I try to expose him to the same stimulus that the rest of his team has been exposed to over the last 4 to 6 weeks, he's going to suffer for that, right? He's going to be overtrained, he's going to overreach, and he's going to potentially suffer an injury, right? So that's where percentages can get really muddled and really murky, is that we're really, maybe not even muddled or murky, but like very inappropriate for the population, right? Ineffective for the population. Because if you can't control for the external factors, you don't know what their stress and fatigue accumulation is, so you can't account for that, right? Like, I don't know what these guys are doing outside of here. You know, I may have like a very surface level or topical or superficial sort of understanding of what they do, but what they're really doing, I don't know. And it's not because it's clandestine and all that kind of stuff, but it's just not something that I'm involved in, right? So I can't account for or control their, you know, their external operations outside of the weight room. So using a precise, bookended sort of percentage-based system with right and left limits is not going to yield the best benefit, in my opinion, right? So that's where RPE comes in. So RPE, for those of you who don't know, stands for rate of perceived exertion, and is essentially a scale of what I use, 1 to 10, that indicates how hard you feel you're working for a given exercise or for a given rep range or whatever it is. Typically, the way that I use it is for a 1 rep max, but you can use it for a 3 or a 5 or whatever you want to do, right? It just gets a little bit confusing when you start saying like, okay, I want you to use an RPE of 9, which is almost a true max or a true maximal effort for a single versus a 9 for a triple, right? Those are two very different numbers. Those are two very different levels of exertion. It's the same level of exertion, it's just different weight, different output. So you got to be kind of careful as the coach when using RPE to make sure that your population has at least a working understanding of what RPE means. Because again, it's really simple. Hey, I want you to go hit a max, right? So I use the conjugate method like I've talked about a whole bunch of times. RPE 9 is typically where I program. For our 1 rep maxes, I don't like taking guys up to a 10 or higher unless they sort of naturally fall within that range. Just because most of the guys, despite how hard they work, just don't have the technical proficiency to hold on to a true max and like hold on to their technique, hold on to their form, their posture, their positioning, all that kind of stuff under a maximal or super maximal load without there being a high degree of risk for injury, right? As a power lifter, if I get hurt lifting, I get hurt doing what I love, right? My operators, if they get hurt lifting, it takes them out of their job. It takes them out of the fight, so to speak. So I have to be very careful about how I prescribe that RPE and that intensity and how high I let them go before I step in and say, hey, we're done, right? But again, an RPE for a single, RPE 9 for a single is very different than an RPE of 9 for a set of 5, right? Very, very different sort of relative intensities, right? It's the same level of exertion because it's a 9 on both ends, but it's just the 5 is going to be much more aggressive because you're doing 5 times as many reps, right? But where RPE comes in as valuable within the tactical population is that it allows for subjective, how do I say this? Subjective mitigation of load and intensity or subjective modification of load and intensity based on relative level of preparedness. Man, write that one down. Basically what that means is that if I prescribe an RPE of 9 for a single and one of my guys comes in and he says, hey man, my kids were sick all night, I didn't get any sleep, I feel like crap tonight or crap today, right? I may still say, hey, go take it up to a 9, go get something heavy, but don't truly max it out, right? So the 9 allows him to put forth a 9 out of 10 level effort without putting a 9 out of 10 load on his back, right? And there's like if we're talking about squatting, right, or in his hands or whatever, right? And there's a difference, right? Because the level of your exertion is not necessarily the amount of weight on the bar, right? So I say it's like if I come in as a power lifter and I just did a meet, right, and I'm all jacked up, I'm sore, I'm beat up, I'm broken down, all that kind of stuff. If I go to squat, 405 is not anywhere near, especially my gear, right? Not anywhere near a max. But 405 for that day might be an RPE of 9 based on how I feel, right? So it's a subjective measure of how you feel and how prepared you feel relative to that day or respective to that day. So again, a subjective modification of load and intensity relative to level of preparedness for that day, something like that, right? Whatever I said before, that was super smart sounding. So that's where RPE is very valuable within the tactical population, is that when guys come and say, hey, we had a night range, we were out until 3 in the morning, we're here at 7 a.m., we got 2 hours of sleep, like, we need to back off today. So like, great, we can still hit something intense, but we can back that load way down so that they're not really exposed to an overload, right? Because there's a difference between a load and an overload, right? An appropriate level of load versus a super maximal overload. So if a guy can squat, let's say a guy squats 405, but again, his kids were sick, he was on a night range, he's sick, whatever it is, right? He may not be able to approach that 405. Like that 405 may be like an RPE of 11 or 12, right? It may be a super maximal load that he can't recover from or that he's not prepared to take, right? So if we bring him down and say, hey, go hit an 8 or a 9 out of 10, but don't worry about what the weight is, just worry about how it feels, right? That allows for much more fluidity and dynamic control or dynamic modification of the load. So it's load and fatigue manipulation essentially across a training session. But again, your athletes have to understand that, right? And so that's part of the process of being a coach, is being able to teach what that RPE means and how to apply it, right? And again, it can get murky if you do like a 1, a 3, a 5, whatever for your rep maxes and say, hey, I want you to hit an RPE of 9 out of 5 or out of a set of 5, right? That's very different than an RPE of 9 for a single. So you got to kind of operate under the KISS principle, right? Keep it simple, stupid. And not that these guys are stupid, but these guys are very smart, right? But they just don't understand training the way that we as coaches and programmers and people who have been doing this their entire lives do. Just like I can pull the trigger on an M4, but I'm not a marksman, right? Like I can shoot a gun, but I'm by no means an operator, right? So it's just, sort of tit for tat, right? And then RPE can be prescribed across, sort of submaximal efforts as well, right? So like, I use RPE of like a 6 to a 7 for secondary movements. So like, let's say we squat, we hit an RPE 9 for a single, and then we drop down to barbell RDL for 3 sets of 10. I can say, hey, go hit about a 7 out of 10 intensity. And again, I'm not so concerned about what the weight on the bar is, unless a guy is like completely sandbagging and I can tell. Then we might have a conversation about it. But again, these are adults, so they can do whatever they want, right? But again, I'll prescribe like 3 sets of 10 at an RPE of 7 because I'm not so concerned with like blowing them out necessarily with this secondary movement, because they already got a super maximal or maximal level of stimulus through their max effort movement. So we don't need that same level of intensity for the secondary and the tertiary and the accessory movements, right? So again, RPE can be a very useful way of sort of prioritizing training and establishing a hierarchy within training of like what's the most important, what's next important, so forth and so on down the chain, right? And you can do high intensity accessories if you want to. You can. You don't have to, right? It just depends on what phase you're in, where you're at with your guys. So like if I prescribe again box squat, straight bar, RPE 9 for a single, and then we do 3 sets of 10 barbell RDL and an RPE of 7, I can say, great, okay, so we got that work in, because a barbell RDL, it can still be a very aggressive movement, right? It can still be loaded very heavily if you're capable of it. Whereas like, a lunge, like a dumbbell lunge or a kettlebell or a chain lunge, right? You're probably not going to load that super aggressively because you just did 2, compound movements in a row. So you'd say like, okay, but so I can say like, let's do 3 sets of 8 each leg on a lunge or on a reverse lunge or something like that, and push the RPE up a little bit higher, knowing that it's going to be an inherently more challenging movement because it is a unilateral movement, and the guys are probably not going to pick something very aggressive. Like they're not going to pick a super aggressive loading factor. Like they're not going to go crazy with like 135 or 185 pounds of weight on the bar. They may grab a couple kettlebells or a chain or a dumbbell or whatever, right? So you can sort of artificially cheat the intensity threshold or the intensity curve, so to speak, by pushing it higher, knowing the guys might naturally gravitate towards doing something a little bit less intense because they're already fatigued, right? And because they have to be able to physically operate after training, right? Like this is not the end-all be-all of what they do for the day, right? Like they come in, they train, they eat breakfast, they get cleaned up, and they go back to the team room and they execute whatever they have planned for that day. That could be ranges, could be demos, could be mortars, could be pool, could be whatever it is, right? So they had to physically be able to execute those tasks post-training with minimal impact to to those post-training activities, right? Everything we do in here, like I've talked about before, everything we do in here should supplement and shore up the operator's ability to execute their role and their task outside of here, not detract from it, right? This training should never be a detriment, should never be a detractor, it should never take away from capacity, at least chronically, right? Maybe very acutely, like, hey, we just started a training program, we're kind of jacked up for a couple weeks, or a week, like a little bit sore or whatever, but in the long-term chronic perspective of how training impacts tactical training, right? Skill-specific training, it should never be a detriment, never be a detractor. So again, to kind of recap, percentages, very useful for controllable situations that you understand what the external factors and loads are. Very good for, peaking for a singular event or peaking for planned events, right? Not so great for more fluid or dynamic or unpredictable situations, such as like a tactical population. Whereas RPE can be a little bit challenging to understand if you're not familiar with the system and familiar with its principles, but very useful for allowing freedom of movement within a training load, right? You're still establishing the training intensity, but you're allowing freedom of movement within the training load itself. So, quick and dirty rundown on percentages versus RPE in the tactical operations or the tactical setting. If you have any questions, please feel free to comment. I try to pay attention to it, but I don't always do. You can message me directly through YouTube or on Instagram at Jimberjacked. Please like, comment, subscribe, share all that kind of stuff. And as always, don't waste the pain.